Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, Part 7, The Terminal, Chapter 42. At first, the people in Sovereign City Airport counted time as though they were only temporarily stranded. This was difficult to explain to young people in the following decades, but in all fairness, the entire history of being stranded in airports up to that point was also a history of eventually becoming unstranded, of boarding a plane and flying away. At first, it seemed inevitable that the National Guard would roll in at any moment with blankets and boxes of food, that ground crews would return shortly thereafter, and planes would start landing and taking off again. Day 1, Day 2, Day 48, Day 90, any expectation of a return to normalcy long gone by now, then Year 1, Year 2, Year 3, time had been reset by catastrophe. After a while, they went back to the old way of counting days and months, but kept the new system of years. January 1, Year 3, March 17, Year 4, etc. Year 4 was when Clark realized this was the way the years would continue to be marked from now on, counted off one by one from the moment of disaster. He'd known for a long time by then that the world's changes wouldn't be reversed, but still the realization cast his memories in a sharper light. The last time I ate an ice cream cone in a park in the sunlight, the last time I danced in a club, the last time I saw a moving bus, the last time I boarded an airplane that hadn't been repurposed as living quarters, an airplane that actually took off, the last time I ate an orange. Towards the end of his second decade in the airport, Clark was thinking about how lucky he'd been. Not just the mere fact of survival, which was of course remarkable in and of itself, but to have seen the world end and another begin, and not just to have seen and remembered the splendors of the former world, the space shuttles, and the electrical grid, and the amplified guitars, the computers that could be held in the palm of a hand, and the high-speed trains between cities, but to have lived among those wonders for so long, to have dwelt in that spectacular world for 51 years of his life. Sometimes he lay awake in Concourse B of the Sovereign City Airport and thought, I was there, and the thought pierced him through with an admixture of sadness and exhilaration. It's hard to explain, he caught himself saying sometimes to young people who came into his museum, which had formerly been the Sky Miles Lounge in Concourse C. But he took his role as curator seriously, and he decided years ago that it's hard to explain isn't good enough. So he'd always tried to explain it all anyway, whenever anyone asked about any of the objects he collected over the years, from the airport and beyond. The laptops, the iPhones, the radio from an administrative desk, the electric toaster from an airport staff lounge, the turntable and vinyl records that some optimistic scavenger had carried back from Sovereign City. And of course the context, the pre-pandemic world that he remembered so sharply. No, he was explaining now to a 16-year-old who'd been born in the airport. The planes didn't rise straight up into the sky. They gathered speed on long runways and angled upward. Why did they need the runways? The 16-year-old asked. Her name was Emmanuelle. He had a special fondness for her because he remembered her birth as the only good thing that had happened in that terrible first year. They couldn't get off the ground without gathering speed. They needed momentum. Oh, she said, the engines weren't that powerful then. They were, he said, but they weren't like rocket ships. Rocket ships. The ships we use to go to space. It's incredible, she said, shaking her head. Yes, incredible in retrospect, all of it, but especially the parts having to do with the travel and communications. This was how he arrived in this airport. He'd boarded a machine that transported him at high speed, a mile above the surface of the earth. This was how he'd told Miranda Carroll of her ex-husband's death. He'd pressed a series of buttons on a device that had connected him within seconds to an instrument on the other side of the world, and Miranda, barefoot on a white sand beach with a shipping fleet shining before her in the dark, had pressed a button that had connected her via satellite to New York. These taken for granted miracles that had persisted all around them. By the end of the second decade, most of the airport's population was either born there or had walked in later, but 24 or so people remained who had been there since the day their flights had landed. Clark's flight landed without incident, diverted from Toronto for reasons no one seemed immediately able to explain, and taxied to a gate in Concourse B. Clark looked up from his edits of a 360-degree subordinates report and was struck by the variety of planes on the tarmac. Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, Air Canada, Lufthansa, Air France, and enormous jets parked end to end. When Clark emerged from the jet bridge into the fluorescent light of Concourse B, the first thing he noticed was the uneven distribution of people. Crowds had gathered beneath the television monitors. Clark decided that whatever they were looking at, he couldn't face it without a cup of tea. He assumed it would be a terrorist attack. He bought a cup of Earl Grey at a kiosk and took his time adding the milk. This is the last time I'll stir milk into my tea without knowing what happened, he thought, wistful in advance for the present moment, and went to stand with the crowds beneath the television that was tuned to CNN. The story of the pandemic's arrival in North America had broken while he was in the air. This is another thing that was hard to explain years later, but up until that morning the Georgia flu had seemed quite distant, especially if one happened not to be on social media. Clark had never followed the news very closely and had actually heard about the flu only the day before the flight in a brief newspaper story about a mysterious outbreak of some virus in Paris, and it hadn't been at all clear that it was developing into a pandemic. But now he watched the too late evacuations of cities, the riots outside hospitals on 3 continents, the slow-moving exodus clogging every road, and wished he'd been paying more attention. The gridlocked roads were puzzling because where were all these people going? If these reports were to be believed, not only had the Georgia flu arrived, but it was already everywhere. There were clips of officials from various governments, epidemiologists with their sleeves rolled up, everyone wan and bloodshot and warning of catastrophe, blue-black circles under bloodshot eyes. It's not looking promising for a quick end to the emergency, a newscaster said, understanding the situation to a degree previously unmatched in the history of understatement. And then he blinked at the camera and something in him seemed to stutter, a breaking down of some mechanism that had previously held his personal and professional lives apart, and he addressed the camera with a new urgency. "Mel," he said, "if you're watching this, sweetheart, take the kids to your parents' ranch. Back roads only, my love. No highways. I love you so much." "It must be nice to have the network at your disposal," a man standing near Clark said. "I don't know where my wife is either. You know where your wife is?" His voice carried a high note of panic. Clark decided to pretend the man had asked him where his boyfriend was. "No," he said, "I have no idea." He turned away from the monitor, unable to hear another second of the news. For how long had he been standing there? His tea had gone cold. He drifted down the concourse and stood before the flight status monitors. Every flight had been canceled. How had all this happened so quickly? Why hadn't he checked the news before he left the airport? It occurred to Clark that he should call someone, actually everyone, that he should call everyone he'd ever loved and talk to them and tell them all the things that mattered. But it was apparently already too late for this. His phone displaying a message he'd never seen before. System overload, emergency calls only. He bought another tea because the first one had gone cold, and also he was beset now by terrible fears, and walking to the kiosk seemed like a purposeful action. Also because the 2 young women working at the kiosk seemed profoundly unconcerned by what was unfolding on CNN. Either that or they were extremely stoic, or they hadn't noticed yet, so visiting them was like going back in time to the paradise of a half hour earlier, when he hadn't yet known that everything was coming undone. "Can you tell us more about about what people should be looking out for, the symptoms?" the newscaster asked. "Same things we see every flu season," the epidemiologist said, "just worse. So, for example, aches and pains, a sudden high fever, difficulty breathing. Look," the epidemiologist said, it's a fast incubation period. If you're exposed, you're sick in 3 or 4 hours and dead in a day or 2. "We're going to take a quick commercial break," the newscaster said. The airline staff had no information. They were tight-lipped and frightened. They distributed food vouchers, which by power of suggestion made everyone hungry. So passengers formed lines to buy greasy cheese quesadillas and nacho plates at Concourse B's only restaurant, which was ostensibly Mexican. The two young women in the kiosk continued to serve hot drinks and mildly stale baked goods, frowning every so often at their useless phones. Clark bought his way into the Sky Miles lounge and found Elizabeth Colton in an armchair near a television screen. Tyler sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, killing space aliens on a Nintendo console. "It's crazy," Clark said to Elizabeth, words falling hopelessly short. She was watching the news, her hands clasped at her throat. "It's unprecedented," Elizabeth said. "In all of human history," she trailed off, shaking her head. Tyler groaned softly. He'd suffered a setback in the alien wars. They sat for a while in silence, watching, until Clark couldn't watch any more and excused himself to find more nachos. A final plane was landing, an Air Gradia jet, but as Clark watched, it made a slow turn on the tarmac and moved away from, instead of, towards the terminal building. It parked in the far distance, and no ground crew went to meet it. Clark abandoned his nachos and went to the window. It occurred to him that the Air Gradia jet was as far away from the terminal as it could possibly go. This was where he was standing when the announcement came. For public health reasons, the airport was closing immediately. There would be no flights for the indefinite future. All passengers were asked to collect their bags at baggage claim, to leave the premises in an orderly fashion, and to please not flip out. "This can't be happening," passengers said to each other and to themselves, over nacho platters and in angry clusters in front of vending machines. They swore at airport management, at the TSA, at the airlines, at their useless phones, furious because fury was the last defense against understanding what the news stations were reporting. Beneath the fury was something literally unspeakable, the television news carrying an implication that no one could yet bring themselves to consider. It was possible to comprehend the scope of the outbreak, but it wasn't possible to comprehend what it meant. Clark stood by the terminal's glass wall in the Mexican restaurant, watching the stillness of the Air Gradia jet in the far distance, and he realized later that if he didn't understand at that moment why it was out there alone, it was only because he didn't want to know. The workers at the restaurants and the gift shop chased out their customers and locked down steel shutters and gates, walked away without looking back. The passengers around Clark began departing too, an exodus that merged with the slow processions leaving the other two concourses. Elizabeth and Tyler emerged from the Sky Miles lounge. "Are you leaving?" Clark asked. It still wasn't entirely real. "Not yet," Elizabeth said. She looked a little deranged, but so did everyone else. "Where would we go? You saw the news." Everyone who'd been watching the news knew that roads everywhere were impassable, cars abandoned where they'd run out of gas, all commercial airlines shut down, no trains or buses. Most of them were leaving the airport anyways because the voice over the intercom said they should. "I think I'll stay here for the moment," Clark said. A few others apparently had had the same thought, and some who'd left returned after half an hour with reports that there was no ground transportation. The others had set out walking for Severn City, they said. Clark waited for an airport official to come and chase all of them away, the 100-odd passengers who remained at the terminal, but none did. An Air Gradia agent was in tears by the ticket counter. The screen over her head still read, "Air Gradia Flight 452 now arriving," but when her radio crackled, Clark heard the word quarantine. Half of the remaining passengers had tied scarves or t-shirts over their mouths and noses, but it had been hours by now, and if they were all going to die of flu, Clark thought, wouldn't at least some of them have been sick already? The passengers who remained in the airport were mostly foreign. They looked out the windows at the airplanes on which they'd arrived, Cathay Pacific, Lufthansa, Singapore Airlines, Air France, parked end to end on the tarmac. They spoke in languages Clark didn't understand. A little girl did cartwheels up and down the length of Concourse B. Clark walked the length of the airport, restless, and was stunned to see the security checkpoints were unmanned. He walked through He walked through and back 3 or 4 times just because he could. He thought it would be liberating, but all he felt was fear. He found himself staring at everyone he saw, looking for symptoms. No one seemed sick, but could they be carrying it? He found a corner far from his fellow passengers as possible and stayed there for some time. "We just have to wait," Elizabeth said, when he came to sit with her again. "Surely by tomorrow morning we'll see the National Guard." Arthur had always liked her optimism, Clark remembered. No one emerged from the Air Gratia jet on the tarmac. A young man was doing push-ups by gate B20. He'd do a set of 10, then lie on his back and stare unblinking at the ceiling for a while, then another 10, etc. Clark found a discarded New York Times on a bench and read Arthur's obituary. Noted film and stage actor, dead at 51. A life summed up in a series of failed marriages. Miranda, Elizabeth, Lydia, and a son whose present absorption in his handheld Nintendo was absolute. When Arthur collapsed on stage, someone...
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
When Arthur collapsed on stage, someone from the audience had performed CPR, the obituary said, but that audience member remained unidentified. Clark folded the paper into his suitcase. Clark's grasp of Midwestern American geography was shaky. He wasn't entirely sure where he was. He'd gathered from the items on offer at the souvenir shop that they were somewhere near Lake Michigan, which he could picture because he retained an internal bird's-eye snapshot of the Great Lakes from his time in Toronto. But he'd never heard of Severn City. The airport seemed very new. Beyond the tarmac and the runways, he could see only a line of trees. He tried to pinpoint his location on his iPhone, but the map wouldn't load. No one's phones were working, but word spread that there was a payphone down in baggage claim. Clark stood in line for half an hour, then dialed all his numbers, but there were only busy signals and endless ringing. Where was everyone? The man behind him in line sighed loudly, so Clark gave up the phone and spent some time wandering the airport. When he was tired of walking, he returned to a bench he'd staked out earlier by gate B17, lay on his back on the carpet between the bench and the wall of glass. Snow began to fall in the late afternoon. Elizabeth and Tyler were still in the Sky Miles lounge. He knew he should be sociable and talk to them, but he wanted to be alone, or as alone as he could be in an airport with 100 other terrified and weeping people. He ate a dinner of corn chips and chocolate bars from a vending machine, spent some time listening to Coltrane on his iPod. He was thinking of Robert, his boyfriend of 3 months. Clark wanted very much to see him again. What was Robert doing at this moment? Clark stared up at the news. Around 10 p.m., he brushed his teeth, returned to his spot by gate B17, stretched out on the carpet, and tried to imagine he was home in his bed. He woke at 3 in the morning, shivering. The news had worsened. The fabric was unraveling. It'll be hard to come back from this, he thought, because in those first days it was still inconceivable that civilization might not come back from this at all. Clark was watching NBC when a teenager approached him. He noticed her earlier sitting by herself with her head in her hands. She looked about 17 and had a diamond nose stud that caught the light. "I'm sorry to ask," she said, "but do you have any Effexor?" "Effexor? I've run out," she said. "I'm asking everyone." "I'm sorry, I haven't any. What is it?" "An antidepressant," the girl said. "I thought I'd be home in Arizona by now." "I'm so sorry. How awful for you." "Well," the girl said, "thanks anyway." And Clark watched her walk away to make inquiries of a couple only slightly older than she was, who listened for a moment, then shook their heads in unison. Clark was thinking ahead to a time he'd sit with Robert in a restaurant in New York or London, and they'd raise a glass of wine to their tremendous good fortune at having made it through. How many of their friends would have died by the time he saw Robert again? There'd be funerals to go to, memorial services, probably a certain measure of grief and survivor's guilt to contend with, therapy and such. What a terrible time that was, Clark said softly to an imaginary Robert practicing for the future. Awful, imaginary Robert agreed. Remember those days when you were in the airport and I didn't know where you were? Clark closed his eyes. The news continued on the overhead screens, but he couldn't bear to watch. The stacked body bags, the riots, the closed hospitals, the dead-eyed refugees walking on interstates. Think of anything else. If not the future, the past. Dancing with Arthur when they were young in Toronto, the taste of Orange Julius, that sugary orange drink he'd only ever tasted in Canadian shopping malls. The scar on Robert's arm just above the elbow from where he'd broken his arm very badly in the 7th grade. The bouquet of tiger lilies that Robert had sent to Clark's office just the last week. Robert in the mornings. He liked to read a novel while he ate breakfast. It was possibly the most civilized habit Clark had ever encountered. Was Robert awake at this moment? Was he trying to leave New York? The storm had passed. The snow lay deep on the wings of the airplanes. There were no de-icing machines, no tire tracks, no footprints. The ground workers had departed. Air Gradia 452 was still alone on the tarmac. There was a moment later in the day when Clark blinked and realized he'd been staring into space for some time. He had intimations of danger, that there was hazard in allowing his thoughts to drift too loosely, so he tried to work, to read over his 360-degree reports. But his thoughts were scattered, and also he couldn't help but wonder if the target of the 360-degree and all the people he'd interviewed were dead. He tried to reread his newspapers on the theory that this required less concentration than the reports, came across Arthur's New York Times obituary again, and realized that the world in which Arthur had died already seemed quite distant. He'd lost his oldest friend, but if the television news was accurate, then in all probability, everyone here with him in the airport had lost someone too. All at once he felt an aching tenderness for his fellow refugees, these 100 or so strangers here in the airport. He folded his paper and looked at them, his compatriots, sleeping or fretfully awake on benches and on carpets, pacing, staring at screens, or out at the landscape of airplanes and snow, everyone waiting for whatever came next.